like to think of Britain as a fortress, an island stronghold moated by the sea. It's a belief that has sustained the British people through the centuries. But it's a myth, nothing but a comforting illusion. Our deepest fear, running like a chill through the bloodstream of the nation, has been a threat of invasion.
This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happy.
Shakespeare got it wrong. Since the dawn of time, the sea has made us vulnerable, not impregnable. And the defence of our coastline has been a pressing and urgent need. Britain is like a human body, not one that's sheathed in armour, but one that's open to attack. Here's the jugular, the Straits of Dover, and here the vulnerable underbelly, the south coast. Here the Isle of Wight, a splendid place to capture, to serve as a bridgehead for any invader. And here Cornwall, providing a very tempting toehold. And there are many secret ways of entry into Britain, through Ireland here, through Scotland, through Wales. And here is the heart, London, the ultimate goal for any invader. And like a wound to a body, an attack could seem slight at first, but turn out to be fatal. This is the story of Britain since 1066. And at that time, there have been at least 50 invasion attempts or actual enemy landings on British soil. But we have mostly written them out of the nation's history books. It is a story of heroism and luck, tragedy and farce. The weather too has played its part. It is a story of great castles and of small communities, some of which have never recovered from the experience of invasion, of lonely watchtowers, and forts built often in panic to repel the enemy. These buildings tell the story of a people living with a very real threat of imminent invasion, and of the determined and often ingenious plans they made to resist. Of all the invasion routes open to an enemy, the quickest and most tempting, from the Normans to Napoleon and Hitler, has always been the dash across the Channel at its narrowest point, 21 miles from France to the Kent coast. Standing guard over the White Cliffs is one of the great fortifications of Western Europe. Dover Castle was called by one medieval chronicler the key to England. Standing on the ramparts of Dover Castle is like standing on the abyss. More than anywhere else in Britain, what happened here would prove crucial for our national survival. Built in the 12th and 13th centuries, Dover is the ultimate expression of a key idea in defensive building. Two concentric rings of walls create defence in depth. If attackers penetrated the outer walls, they were then subject to attack from the higher inner ring, and then from the keep at the castle's heart. In medieval times, Dover Castle represented the state of the art of fortification, which was just as well, because when it was besieged by Prince Louis of France in 1216, the fate of England hung on the outcome. The French siege of Dover was the Battle of Britain of its day, and one of the most determined and brilliantly executed of medieval warfare. Louis claimed the English throne rightfully belonged to his father. Soon only Dover Castle stood in his way. Louis' siege weapons opened the attack. But the real danger to the defenders was to come from another quarter altogether. Most of the castles that succumbed to siege during the Middle Ages were overcome not by frontal attack, but by enemy tunnels. It was a devilishly cunning business. The besiegers would tunnel below the foundations of the towers and walls. They would collapse, and then the besiegers would rush inside. So in the siege of 1216, the French took up their position here, where I am right now. They wanted to attack what they perceived to be the most vulnerable part of the castle, which is the North Gate. And that is the North Gate, or rather the remains of it. What the French did is they dug a tunnel under one of the towers of the North Gate, and then they packed this tunnel with firewood, and then they set fire to it. As the tower collapsed, the French stormed through the breach. There's been an amazing recent discovery, concealed and long forgotten behind later alterations. It's this amazing room. It dates from about 1210. It's the lowest story of the West Tower of the North Gate. From this actual room, the English would have fought the French during the Great Siege. Through this window, archers would have shot at Frenchmen over there. And here is something more extraordinary still. These stones were burnt pink by the fire that spread into this room from the tunnel over there, dug by the French besiegers in 1216. But the collapse of the tower was not the end of the story. The English defenders managed to plug the gap with timber and beat back Louis's men as they tried to take the castle. Eventually, the French lost heart and called a truce. The siege was over, and with it, the French invasion. One building had saved a nation. The key to England remained in English hands. During most of British history, if you lived on the south coast, you lived in a war zone. The coastal towns and villages were in the very front line of enemy attack. During the 100 Years' War with France in the 14th and 15th century, invasion quite simply became a way of life and of death. Southampton, 1338, pillaged by the French who hanged the townsfolk in the streets. Rye, Sussex, 1339, overrun by a French force of 40,000 men. Yarmouth, Isle of Wight, burnt and left desolate. The coastal plain of Rumney Marsh had long been plagued by French incursions. In 1282, King Edward I had decided to act. The new town of Winchelsea would be designed specifically to repel invaders. The town was based on the English fortified towns in France called bastides, built to hold English-occupied territories there. Might Winchelsea become a template for the defence of the south coast? The town was organised around a regular grid of streets, a long way from the organic, chaotic street plan of other medieval towns. More to the point, the layout of the town made it easier to defend. Troops could be rushed at speed through these straight, wide streets to threaten sections of the town wall. It was a bold and functional piece of urban design. The town was surrounded by a ditch and entry controlled by a series of splendid gates. This one marked the southern edge of this mighty town. Only the street plan remains of what was once a medieval masterpiece. Merchants' houses with vast wine cellars lined its wide streets.
If it were intended to be used as the French Bastides were used, then of course it was a centre for all the local area, not just for the town itself. When the French Bastides came under attack, the population from large area all around came inside, because that was the area intended and built to be defended. The various sections are known as quarters. Each one had a number.
Each one had a number? Each street had a number?
No, well, the quarters had a number and the streets had a number.
Ooh.
The building in which we are now was in quarter number 8, and it was also in 3rd Street, or tertia strata.
Good heavens, rather like New York, isn't
exactly.
it? I mean, actually, wonderful.
First, second,
third,
First, second and 3rd Street, and they went right down in this direction. The 100 Years' War began in 1337, and Winchelsea was attacked at that time. But by far the most serious raid was in 1360, when it was very severely attacked by the French, who landed here, and they really devastated the town.
On the 15th of March 1360, Winchelsea's elaborate defences proved of little use. The French entered the town by slipping over the undefended town wall, or by passing through one of the gates, which may have been left open for them. Treachery on the part of an English resident or the work of a French agent, no one ever found out. The inhabitants took refuge in the only place left to them.
They killed all that resisted them, regardless of sex, age, or station, and took captive married ladies, girls, and women that pleased their eyes. Lustfully desiring one, they used her until she expired through a broken spirit.
This lonely track is still known as Dead Man's Lane. After one particularly brutal attack, the churchyard over there simply couldn't accommodate all the new corpses. They had to be buried here. It's a grim thought that beneath this track and within these embankments are the bones of over 100 men, women and children. Three years after the 1360 raid, half the brave new town still lay in ruins. The bold experiment had failed. The population dwindled, and outlying sections of the town fell into decay. On these fields stood large houses. Strange bumps are all that remain of one of its wonderful numbered quarters. The scars of invasion are all around us, if only we knew how to read them. The threat of invasion by the French made the medieval Englishman, if he could afford it, turn his home into a castle.
We have granted license to our faithful Edward Dallingridge, Knight, that he may make into a castle the manor house of Bodium in the county of Sussex, for the defence of the country and the resistance to our enemies. The King at Westminster, 20th of October, 1385.
Bodium Castle is a classic medieval defensive building. In its semi-ruined state, it puts its wall-like skeleton on display, revealing the secret of how the living organism worked, right down to the stones themselves. Now here we can see how the thick castle wall is built. There are two skins, an outer skin and an inner skin, formed with large, squared sandstone blocks. Now, between these two skins is this massive area here. This is formed with rubble mixed with lime mortar, poured from above into these skins as the wall goes up. You can see here, from this random mix of stones of various sizes, it really is just simply poured. Now, the secret to the success of a wall like this, where its strength comes from, is from the lime mortar, this material here, which glues all the rubble together. In fact, the stones are only half the story. Lime mortar has played an unsung but heroic part in the defence of Britain, holding it all together in more senses than one. Now the story starts here with this stuff, quicklime, a dangerous material. I put my goggles on and indeed my gloves on to handle it. Now it's dangerous because it desires to devour moisture, like my hands. It's made famously to devour corpses. It eats moist flesh of the corpse. Okay, so this quicklime is mixed with water. The quicklime absorbs the moisture and eventually it becomes a putty, something called lime putty. I've got some lime putty here that's been standing for at least 2 months in this bucket. Nice trowel. This is terrific stuff. Here's the lime putty here. I shall risk my flesh here by getting a sample to show you. Oh, goodness me. This is something you should not do at home, really, but lovely stuff. Lime putty. Oh, goodness, and it's starting to bubble. It's like a kettle. It's incredible. Now, the thing is, the mortar can keep its moisture even over the centuries. At the deep core of these walls, the mortar is still soft, even today. What this means is that these great thick walls, made of a soft material like this, are able to absorb the shock of missiles being thrown at them. Incredible. The strength of the material lies at the flexible, soft core of the walls. Bodium seems to have been plucked from the pages of a medieval catalogue, with its mighty towers and moat, its murder holes in the ceiling for arrows or hot oil to repel invaders, even gun ports for firearms coming in at the time. It certainly looks like a castle, but does it actually work? Time for a little experiment. How secure is Bodium? How well will its defences stand up to a raid? We are about to find out. A castle's only as strong as its weakest point, and that window over there, on the light, it's quite large, low near the water. That is the weak point here. Well, this isn't easy, nor, oh goodness, is it dignified. But it does demonstrate, I think, that the defences of this castle can be breached by a raiding party, and that perhaps it is more of a country house than a castle. Excuse me while I crawl out of this. Oh! Fortunately, the French never did try to take Bodium, but the days of even the most solid castle were numbered. The terrifying power of guns and gunpowder gave the threat of invasion a new urgency. It dramatically changed the way the islands had to be defended. Indeed, it changed the nature of warfare itself. Though introduced in Europe in the 14th century, early guns were inaccurate and dangerous to the people who fired them as to their intended victims. But by Tudor times, they formed a key part of anti-invasion strategy. England under Henry VIII was in trouble. Henry had been excommunicated by the Pope, and Catholic Europe was gathering for the kill. It seemed certain that France would once more try to invade. But England's defences were piecemeal and out of date. What was needed was something that could match the terrifying new technology of war. Henry acted swiftly to prepare England for the worst. This is St Mawes, Cornwall. Built by Henry VIII, it forms part of the country's first national system of defence. For the first time, England was to have a chain of forts guarding key sections of the coast. These are practical, muscular buildings, machines almost. They were designed along scientific principles with only one thing in mind: combat. There are few creature comforts here. They were machines not for living in, but for fighting in. England had never seen anything like these gun forts, built according to Henry's favourite theories of fortification. All over Europe, engineers frantically grappled to find a way to withstand bombardment from ever more powerful guns. Henry's gun forts were designed to deflect enemy shot from the thick curved walls, while guns could be mounted in layers to fire in all directions. This is one of the gun rooms. With its heavily timbered ceiling, it's rather like a gun deck in one of Henry's warships. The guns were fired from vaulted alcoves called casemates. The designers had a really good eye for detail. When gunpowder explodes, it creates a vast amount of smoke. Now, to ensure that the gunners could see and breathe during action, the designer of this place inserts a little chimney up here in the casemate to extract the smoke. And here's another highly practical and rather unusual design feature. The latrines for the gunners were placed just outside the gun platform, so they needn't be away from their guns for very long. The forts were also meant to withstand attack from the land, with cunning features designed to help defenders engaged in hand-to-hand fighting inside the fort itself. Together with its sister Fort Pendennis, St Mawes guarded the entrance to Falmouth Harbour. This rather wonderful Tudor map shows us how this system of defence worked. Here we have St Mawes Castle, and about a mile away, across the estuary, is Pendennis Castle. Their guns would command this water. That was the whole point of Henry's system of fortifications, to defend anchorages like this from enemy invasion fleets. For Henry, maps were as potent a weapon against invasion as his remarkable gun forts. In the British Library in London is a document that sheds remarkable light on the King's obsession. an enormous defensive survey of the south coast of England. When does this date from?
This one dates from 1538 almost certainly.
38. It shows us a section of the south coast.
It shows us a section of the south coast from Lyme to Bournemouth, but in fact it doesn't portray it as it actually is, but in the way that's most useful for somebody who's defending the shores. The sandy bays, like Bournemouth here, are enormously exaggerated in size, and it's quite simple to see the reason why, because ships can land there, and in fact there's a depiction of a ship coming up to land.
With massive beaches and
with
so on.
massive beaches and so on. But where you get rocks, well, nobody's going to land there, so you can more or less say, well, there's a cliff here, but now we can pass on to something which is much more serious, because nobody is going to land under a cliff.
So these map makers, obviously very special men, weren't
They
they?
were indeed. They had a direct line to the king, and they carried in their heads the visual image of the kingdom.
Presumably these chaps, they'd build up a knowledge of one country and then they could quite easily change sides, couldn't they?
And they did. These people switched sides whenever they wanted to.
Look at this map, suddenly realise that really are passports to invasion, aren't they? Passports to the country.
They are, and if you want a modern parallel, it's very much like the rocket scientists who worked for Hitler and who were welcomed in America, and everything was cleaned out and their records were cleaned, so long as the Americans could get the skills. With the map makers, it was exactly the same.
That's the parallel, isn't it? That's absolute analogy, of course. Even if you knew the enemy was gathering his forces for an invasion, you wouldn't necessarily know when that invasion was coming or where the forces were going to land. But when the moment came, that news had to spread across the country, and fast. As an early warning system, burning beacons probably date back to the Anglo-Saxons. By Elizabethan times, there was an elaborate national network. One beacon ablaze meant ships had been sighted. 2, they were nearing the coast, and 3, invasion was imminent. With Philip of Spain bent on the destruction of Elizabethan Protestant England, the beacons might be needed at any time. The beacons themselves, on their wooden poles, have of course all rotted away. But high on the Blackdown Hills in Devon is a strange little building said by locals to date back to the days of the beacon watchers. So what are we to make of this strange, primitive structure? Can it really be over 400 years old? I mean, it's beautifully built, very solid, a very nice arch here. It's a very sophisticated construction, a dome, but I suppose being here on this very exposed site, a stone dome is the strongest sort of roofing to give the building, make it last. You know, I think it is a 16th century beacon watcher's hut. Ooh. Gosh, now things really are getting interesting. This cylindrical form and the dome here make a powerfully architectural interior, rather like being inside a miniature Roman temple. And the opening up there, that's where the post went, the post supporting the fire basket's actual beacon. And on the post were rungs up which the beacon keepers would climb to light the beacon, to put it out again. And through these windows, one here, one over there, the beacon keepers would stare, looking at the neighbouring beacon some distance away on the hill. When that was alight, when the warning came from there, this beacon would be lit and the warning would be passed on. It's incredible. When the Spanish Armada was sighted off Land's End on July the 29th, 1588, England faced one of the most formidable invasion forces ever assembled. The English fleet braced itself for battle. This was no raiding party. The object was the conquest of England and its return to Roman Catholicism. The consequences would have been quite extraordinary. England would have become a second-rate, subservient, European power. There would have been no British Empire, no English-speaking United States of America. For a week, the Armada was harried by English ships along the south coast until it reached Calais, where it was to pick up a huge invasion force. The Spanish managed to hold off the English fleet, and invasion looked imminent. The English had to act decisively. Fireships were launched into the Armada, which scattered in panic. With its defensive formation shattered, the Spanish fleet was suddenly vulnerable. Damaged and in confusion, the Armada fled. The invincible Armada, battered and humbled, was blown by the prevailing winds around the southeast corner of England, with English ships snapping and biting at its heels. The so-called Protestant wind kept the Armada heading north along the east coast of England, north around Scotland, and the route is shown very clearly on this contemporary chart. Here you can see it. The Spaniards then headed back towards Spain, sailing to the west of Ireland. The fate of many of the lost ships was never known. They were simply swallowed up in huge seas or wrecked on lonely coasts. The beacon watchers and some terrible weather had come to England's rescue. Not so much a victory as a lucky escape. But it had a transforming effect on England, turning Elizabeth into a national goddess and forging the identity of the nation. If the Straits of Dover have been the nation's jugular, other parts of the island have offered less obvious invasion routes. The long peninsula of Cornwall has often been a source of anxiety to defenders. The shape and location of Cornwall offers an invasion toehold, as this Elizabethan map shows, a first step on the road to conquest. Not only is Cornwall the nearest part of the British Isles towards enemies such as Spain, but also Cornwall is virtually an island in its own right. If it was taken, it could be held against British counterattack using the River Tamar here, which is virtually a moated ditch separating Cornwall from the rest of England. It was a point not lost on Sir Walter Raleigh.
There is no part of England so dangerously seated, so thinly manned, so little defended, and so easily invaded.
While everyone remembers the failure of the Armada, a rather more successful Spanish attack has been largely ignored. The year was 1595. The Spanish Armada had been defeated, but the memory of Spanish ships advancing along the coast had not been forgotten. And Spain, for its part, was still intent on humiliating, even conquering England. And so, the quiet fishing village of Mousehole became an unlikely theatre of war. Mousehole in 1595 was a flourishing community with its own courthouse and market. Then, on Wednesday, the 23rd of July, Spanish ships were sighted in the bay. On board were over 300 heavily armed soldiers. What could an unarmed population do against a force of professional troops? In a matter of hours, the Spanish had burned, killed, and looted their way through the town. Only a single house was left standing. One man didn't flee. The owner of this house, Jenkin Kegwin, the local squire. Now, he put up a fight defending his house, his wife and his two sons from the Spaniards who were torching the town. And in this, Kegwin was successful. The house is still here, a wonderfully solidly built piece of work, indeed the only house to have survived the Spanish attack on Mousehole. But Kegwin was killed in the process, hit by this shot, which has been preserved in the house by succeeding generations of owners. The invaders marched on to the parish church at Paul, half a mile inland. The Spanish captain's account of what happened is revealing.
In the surrounding hamlets, we burned a mosque with a solid tower in which a lot of people had taken shelter.
Well, this is it. The so-called mosque, sacked by the Spanish invaders. To call this parish church a mosque seems absolutely extraordinary. But of course it's a reminder that to the Spanish, the English Protestants were heathens, much like the Muslims the Spanish had been fighting for centuries. This, of course, was a holy war with all the violence, bigotry, and ignorance that goes with it. The Spaniards at Mousehole behaved much as Spaniards were meant to behave. They marched arrogantly up and down. They burnt the houses of peace-loving Cornishmen, and they brought Catholicism back to England in a particularly ferocious manner. To the horror of the Cornish, the Spanish celebrated a victory mass in nearby Penzance, vowing to return and build a monastery there once he had conquered England and restored it to the Catholic faith. The Spanish triumph at Mousehole absolutely appalled the English authorities. One local military commander, writing to Sir Francis Drake, called it a disgrace. How, after years of anti-invasion preparations, could the Spanish have landed and done so much damage and got away unharmed? Could the Cornish have put up a better show in 1595? Someone who might know lived just across the bay from Mousehole at St Michael's Mount. His family has lived on the mount since the 17th century. At the time of the Spanish raid of 1595, the mount was supposed to be a well-armed fort answerable to Queen Elizabeth. Its job was to guard the bay, yet it did nothing during the raid. Why?
Well, there's a very efficient garrison commander at St Michael's Mount called Arthur Harris. And we have letters that he wrote to the Queen asking for more guns and more ammunition. And he said that all he had was 2 guns on the whole fortifications. The Queen was rather hard up at the time. It was after the expense of defeating the Armada, and there had been very bad harvests in England at the time for 2 or 3 years, and even famine. And the gunners just hadn't been paid, and there was no powder and shot or anything on the island. So St Michael's Mount was at that time entirely underfunded. I doubt that the Spanish realized that, but if they had, they would have come and captured the castle.
They kept quite a well away from the mount, didn't they, right over there, is that right?
Oh yes, it's well known that the mount gun had to be avoided at all costs.
After 3 days on the rampage, the Spanish troops set sail for home. Had they hoped to find Catholic support in Cornwall, or was it revenge for the defeat of the Armada? What's certain is that Mousehole, like many other places devastated by invasion forces, never really recovered from the raid. After 1595, nothing more is heard of its chapel, its fairs, or its courthouse. But it's not only on the coast that the threat of the invader has been felt. Britain's rivers have always been potential highways leading to the vitals of the nation. Since medieval times, no invasion force had come close to London, the heart of England. Then, in the mid-17th century, the country found itself at war with an enemy who was terrifyingly ill-equipped to fight. A foe which was to come within 13 miles of the capital itself, causing one of the greatest panics in the nation's history. The year was 1667, and the foe in question, the Dutch, Britain's great rivals in the race to dominate world trade and the beginnings of empire. Popular feelings against the Dutch ran high. As one writer put it at the time, the country is mad for war. On the River Medway, the pride of the English Navy was gathered at the Royal Dockyard at Chatham. Anybody who knew the state of the nation's defences lived in dread they might be put to the test. The terrible truth was that the country was unprepared for war with the Dutch. Dockyard workers and sailors hadn't been paid for months. Morale on board ship was dangerously low. And here at Chatham, the rope workers had simply walked out in protest. The authorities' anxiety soon turned to panic. On the 9th of June 1667, a force of 72 Dutch men of war was sighted approaching the east coast of Britain. Unchallenged, they sailed past the Isle of Sheppey and into the mouth of the River Medway. What the Dutch had in mind was a kind of 17th century Pearl Harbor, a devastating strike against the enemy navy in his home port. The Dutch squadron sailed on an incoming tide around Garrison Point over there, towards Sheerness. The fort at Sheerness had just been completed and it guarded the approach to the Medway. Everything depended on it putting up a stout defence. As the Dutch ships came into view, the 16 great guns in the fort fired. But catastrophe followed. Every gun was thrown from its rotting carriage. The Dutch could not believe their luck. With the guns at Sheerness useless, the Dutch stormed the fort with humiliating ease and captured the town and its vast stores of ammunition and supplies. The great hope of saving the shipping anchored up Medway now rested on the mighty defensive chain, which was intended to bar entry to the river to enemy shipping. The chain stretched from Gillingham over there to Hoo over there. The chain was a massive affair, was 350 feet long, and each link had a circumference of about 6 inches. It was secured by a crane house on each bank. These kept it at about 9 foot below the surface of the water. The Dutch, however, undaunted, attacked. At the second attempt, the Dutch charge smashed through the chain, which had been left poorly defended. The fleet stormed upriver towards Chatham. They sank or captured almost every English vessel in their path. The English crews had fled almost to a man. The Dutch triumph in the Medway hardly features in our history books or in our art galleries. But for Dutch artists, it's been a glorious theme. Sitting in his office in the Admiralty, Samuel Pepys imagined the unimaginable. A full-scale attack on London.
All our hearts do ache, for the Dutch have broke the chain and burned our ships. I do fear that the whole kingdom is undone. God knows what disorders we may fall into. To bed, with a heavy heart full of fear and fright.
In the Medway, the final obstacle between Chatham and the enemy fleet lay just around the bend of the river, at Upnor Castle. Upnor Castle was 100 years old, a relic of Elizabeth's defences against the Spaniards. But it was ready for battle, and this time the English were resolved to fight. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 13th of June, the tide changed, and the Dutch advanced with the wind behind them. Upnor's hour had come. The heavy guns were loaded. The gunners stood right here. As the Dutch appeared round the bend over there, the English guns fired. Once again, a single building had held out against the invader. But as they headed home, the Dutch took with them the English flagship, the Royal Charles. The Dutch commander noted with satisfaction, "Nothing more costly has ever been made in England." The Dutch left behind them a nation in a state of deep humiliation. Another diarist, John Evelyn, summed it up.
A dreadful spectacle as ever any Englishman saw, and a dishonour never to be wiped off.
About as far as you can get from the south coast of England is an invasion route that has troubled England and tempted her enemies in equal measure. Invasion by the back door through Scotland. Now, relations between these two countries have often been volatile, and Scotland has had plenty of reasons for welcoming forces hostile to England. The Scottish Highlands have been the breeding ground and the hiding place of generations of Scots fiercely opposed to the English authorities and supported by hostile European powers. When the Jacobite supporters of the exiled Stuart kings rose against the English, they had French support. Might the French succeed in placing a friendly Stuart monarch on the British throne? Attempts to crush the uprisings were hampered by the terrain. In the early 18th century, there were few ways into the Highlands, until the British drove more than 1,000 miles of road through some of the remotest parts of the country. The roads were built for military control. They allowed British forces to transport arms and supplies from fort to fort and to head off Scottish forces and stop them disappearing into the hills. The man charged with building them was General George Wade, who took Imperial Rome as his model of how to use roads to subjugate a people. The roads were built by ordinary soldiers working often in terrible conditions. Now this section appears to be virtually in original state. Certainly there's no tarmac on the surface. Now they were very well built. First of all, a trench was dug, and then great boulders were blasted from the surrounding hillsides with gunpowder, and they were laid at the bottom of the trench. Then smaller rocks broken up with sledgehammer laid on top of the big boulders. And then horses and carts would drag gravel from miles away to lay on the top surface. This was to allow water to go through the road so as to avoid puddles and ice. The final touch was delivered by the soldiers themselves, whose boots would pound the gravel into place as they marched along this wonderful military road. When the Jacobite uprising of Bonnie Prince Charlie was brutally crushed by the Duke of Cumberland, Wade's network of roads was put to the test. At least one English official was satisfied with the result.
For the first time, the Highlanders felt they were accessible, and that their fastnesses could no longer protect them. Our men marched with safety as far as the new roads would carry them, and extinguished the rebellion with dignity and terror, unknown before in that part of the island.
If the Jacobites were feared as the enemy within, opening the back door to the French, then the way had to be blocked to French ships bringing supplies to the port of Inverness. The best place to do it was at the narrowest strip of the Murray Firth. Soon after the defeat of the Jacobite uprising, work began on one of the greatest military buildings in the world. Fort George was part of the final solution to the Jacobite problem. Started in 1748, it took 20 years to build and cost over £200,000, which was more than the annual gross national product for Scotland at that time. At over £1 billion at the day's prices, Fort George took over 1,000 men to build it. It formed the centrepiece of the Duke of Cumberland's strategy to seal off the Jacobites from the French.
Cumberland realised that the thing missing from this web of roads and forts and barracks was the spider in the middle. And so Cumberland's vision of it, I think, was as a huge, great garrison of 2,500 men, which is a third of the size of the town of Inverness at the time. It was by far the biggest garrison in the north, impregnable, from the land, resupplied by sea, and so it was entirely independent, and that could provide the men to kill off any minor risings which happened throughout the Highlands. It was the key part of the anti-invasion defences of North Britain.
Fort George embodied the most sophisticated thinking about the art of fortification. In this world, a fort becomes an ingenious Chinese box, a maze of walls and ditches in which to trap the enemy. This is the geometry of war, a geometry of beauty and cunning. These troops are about to launch a frontal attack on the fort. The fort's keeping very low profile from here because its walls are sunk into deep ditches which protect it from artillery fire. Right, they're off. Now we enter this cleared ground. This is a slope leading up to the fort. It's called the Glacis. And here we're hit by a hail of fire. The cannon in front of us there, they're thundering away. There's musketry coming from the top of the ravelin. The first line of defence is taken. The attackers leap from the Glacis onto the terrace behind. The defenders down here, they're dead or they're fled. But this is defence in depth. They would be under fire still from muskets in the ravelin behind me, but also from cannon up there in the bastion. The only place to go now is down into the great ditch. This is exactly where the defenders want the attackers to be. The more one penetrates into a fortification like this, the more vulnerable one becomes to fire from all sides. By design, this area has been created as a fearful killing ground. Cannon in the bastion behind me, cannon in the bastion in front of me would pour fire into here, along with soldiers lining the parapet up there shooting their muskets. The only hope now for the attackers is to assault the main walls of the fort itself. The fort's designed like a great obstacle course, with the most difficult obstacle being the final one, the wall itself. The attackers would be caught like rats in a trap. Fort George was built after the crisis had passed. It has never seen action. The next time the invader came, it was to a part of the country not nearly so well prepared. In the early hours of Thursday, the 23rd of April, 1778, the people of Whitehaven in Cumberland were awoken by shouts of alarm in the street and a general call to arms. Amazingly, their town was under attack. Already, ships in the harbour were in flames, and the people were told their houses, their warehouses, would soon be set ablaze. But when they got to the harbour, they found it deserted. Fearing the worst, the baffled townspeople rushed to man the guns protecting the port. But it was too late. The cannon, and there were about 30 of them guarding the town, had been spiked, which is to say, a dirty great nail like this had been driven like thus with a mallet into the touch hole here. This made it impossible to fire the cannons. Clearly, the townspeople were dealing with a cunning foe whose planning and foresight made them a force to be reckoned with. With the guns out of action, the mysterious raiders were free to pursue their mission of destruction. Undetected, they made their way along the quay. The moment had come for action. The attack contained elements of real terror and sheer farce in about equal measure. The raiders wanted to burn the shipping in the harbour, about 200 ships there, but their torches went out, and incredibly, not one of the raiders had a tinderbox to rekindle them. What was to be done? Borrow a light from a local house. They burst in here, into this room, and demanded flame from the terrified inhabitants. What the people of Whitehaven didn't know is they were victims of a brand new enemy, the fledgling United States of America. For Britain and America were now at war, with the breakaway colonists struggling for independence. Though the war was fought on American soil, some Americans were determined to take the war to the enemy. Whitehaven was one of the biggest ports in Britain. Someone had decided it was a legitimate target. Despite the raiders' best efforts, the fire had failed to ignite, and the 200 boats moored in the harbour were saved from destruction. By dawn, news of the attack had spread through the town like wildfire. But by this time, these mysterious incendiaries had made good their escape by rowing back to their ship anchored in the bay. Amazingly, the leader of these Yankee raiders was known to the townspeople. John Paul Jones had left England at the age of 12. The port he left from was Whitehaven. His knowledge of the town was later to prove unexpectedly useful to him. Now captain of an American warship, he dreamed of a daring raid that would hit the English where it hurt.
Not all their boasted navy can protect their own coasts. The scenes of distress which they have occasioned in America may soon be brought home to their own doors.
Despite the failure of the raid, Jones became a hero in his adopted land. Today, he is known as the father of the United States Navy. Here was a new kind of invader, driven not by religion or rivalry, but by a new ideology of liberty and republicanism. The spirit of revolution was sweeping Europe and America, ushering in a new era of warfare. For Britain, the biggest threat of all was still to come. Soon, assembled across the Channel would be one of the greatest invasion forces the world had ever seen, an army committed to the conquest of Britain. The country would be gripped by invasion fear. Mothers would frighten their children with threats of the bogeyman. The nation waited in fear for Napoleon.